So without further ado, I'll say welcome and welcome to Victoria Yeager. We are so thrilled to welcome Victoria, who's going to speak about her late husband, General Chuck Yeager, and the book 101 Chuck Yeager-isms, Wit and Wisdom from America's Hero. We're going to introduce our guest in just a moment. I said hi to everybody sort of with the assumption that many are Aero Club members. If you're not yet a member, we're thrilled that you're here, of course. But please, message me or Keith or somebody in the chat. We would love to get you signed up, tell you about all the wonderful things that the Aero Club of New England offers. I'm going to do a little slide screen sharing here, if you don't mind. There we go. I guess you can see that. Okay. Yeah, we are, in fact, the Aero Club of New England. We're basically a social event, which I think I noted. We love the icebreaker events like these, which are often safety oriented. Sometimes they're just fun and very social, but it's just great to be around other pilots and people who enjoy planes and other pilots. We also put forth a number of safety and educational events. This is just a couple of pictures from our last crash course. So this is our last couple of crash courses. They're really, really wonderful events. As we noted, Richard McSpadden here in the middle with Gary Kearney and Georgia Pappas. This is from a couple of years ago. This year's event is going to be on March 15th, as we noted, at the Burlington Marriott. We'll welcome Richard McSpadden along with Stephen K. Brown from the FAA's FAST team, and Colleen D'Alessandro, the regional minister of the FAA, who's going to join us. It is a free event. It is an incredibly worthwhile event. We have the support of many, many sponsors for this event, and we really, really hope that you will plan on joining us. Again, this is just a little bit of an overview about the event at the Burlington Marriott, the Boston Burlington Marriott, not the DoubleTree, the Burlington Marriott, 1 Burlington Road. And you can find out more about the event at acone.org. I mentioned the scholarship program. AOPA, forgive me, the Aero Club of New England underwrites a number of scholarships each and every year since 1984. This is great. We have financially assisted scores of New England students, totaling over $570,000 in scholarships through the years. That's really, really impressive. We're quite proud of it. If you'd like to be a part of that, and your being here tonight and your membership in AOPA makes you a part of that. That makes that all possible. Please just to let anybody from the Aero Club of New England know, and we'd be happy to connect you with our scholarship coordinator. So one more time, we're on Zoom, so please mute, shut the cameras off unless you have something significant to say. We're recording the event tonight, and we're going to handle all questions through the chat, and we will answer those after the presentation. I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome tonight's speaker. It's especially poignant because just 2 days ago, Monday, this past Monday, February 13th, happens to be the 100th birthday of America's hero, General Chuck Yeager. There is really not much that you could say about General Chuck Yeager that hasn't been said already. Calling him an American hero feels a little bit like an understatement, but we all know of his accomplishments and so much that he has done for aviation and for our country. A chance encounter in the foothills of the Sierra Mountains in March of 2000 led to our guest meeting and eventually marrying Chuck Yeager. They had 20 wonderful years together, and here to share some incredible stories of their time together, and also General Yeager's incredible aviation career. On behalf of the Aero Club of New England, please, I'm very, very happy to introduce Victoria Yeager. Victoria, good evening, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So I guess I could start at the beginning. General Yeager was born so far up a holler they had to pipe daylight in. He was born in the hollers of West Virginia, in Myra. The only thing standing there now is a white church. And then he was raised in Hamlin, West Virginia. He would hike the hills, and so he stayed in great shape, and he could fish and he could hunt. And he grew up with a rifle in his hand. And during World War II, they saw that 11% of the fighter pilots shot down 90% of the Germans. And they wanted to find out if there's something common in all of them. And it was, they were all rural kids raised with a gun in their hand. And he started shooting when he was 6, shooting squirrel. He would shoot a squirrel before school, bring it up to mom, and mom would skin it out while he was in school. He'd go to school and he'd hang his gun in the cloakroom in the back. So that a different era. And when he got into high school, the local auto mechanic brought all the boys over after school and taught him about engines and motors. And so that did well for him. He did go to the CMTC camps, civilian military training camps, because they knew World War II was coming. So he went in 39 and 40. And then in 41, he enlisted after high school, after that summer. And people ask him, why did you go into the Army, not the Navy? And he said, the Army recruiter was better. So he went into the Army as a maintenance officer for the airplanes. And as he was going along and doing very well, he realized that the pilots had pretty girls on their arms, they had clean fingernails. And so that's what he wanted to be. But you had to be 20 and have 2 years of college, which he did not. But they weren't getting enough applicants, so they lowered it to 18 and a high school education, which he did have. So he applied. And after he had applied, his pilot said, well, you've never been up in an airplane. Let me take you up and see how it goes. And so they went up in the airplane and Chuck got sick all over his airplane. And he thought, Yeager, man, you made a big mistake. But mind over matter, finishing what you start, he got sick the next 2 or 3 times, but he got over that. And in fact, his instructors thought he'd been flying all his life because he could just feel the airplane. But it was coming from being a maintenance officer and really knowing the whole plane and the egress systems and the systems. That's what made him head and shoulders above other pilots. So he went off to various bases to get trained, and he met Glennis, his first wife, in Oroville. And in Casper, Wyoming, his engine froze and he parachuted out and he was knocked out when he landed. And a farmer picked him up, put him on a horse and carried him out. That hurt his back a lot. He was in the hospital and had broken his back, and they said, you're never going to walk again. Well, in typical Yeager fashion, he said, oh, nonsense. I'm not going back to Hamlin. And he got back on duty and within a month was going off to England. That was November of 43. In about February of 44, he had his first combat assignment, and they went out and they didn't see any Germans. And about March the 4th was the first daylight raid on Berlin by the US. But the weather was stinking, so everybody got called back except for 1 box of bombers and 2 P-51s, one of which was Chuck Yeager. And much later, the leader of the bomber squadron said, we were so happy when the cavalry came in, not knowing that it was Chuck Yeager was one of them. So they go and they bomb Berlin, and on the way back, Chuck shoots down a Heikel 111 and an ME 109, I think. But anyway, he gets credit for 1, not for the 2. And he runs out of ammo, so he calls into the box of bombers. He said, don't you trigger happy people shoot me down. I don't know. I'm a P-51 and I'm coming in. I need protection. And they protected him all the way back to England. Just to show he wasn't so Sierra Hotel, the next day they went down to Bordeaux again. The weather was stinking, but the lead bomber broke protocol and he radioed and said, we can't see the target here. Let's go target 2. And on the radio, the Germans heard them and then they came up. If he had just turned and gone to the second target, they wouldn't have done that. But they came up. Chuck was tail end Charlie, and he saw the bandits at Chuck 6, and the flight leader, O.B. O'Brien, called break. And they turned into them. There were 3 ME 109s, and they all had great hits on Chuck's engine and radiator. That was the weak point of the P-51. He got a few hits off, but he ended up, when there was a static display, he put me in the P-51 to show me. And I'm pretty lithe. I got in, and getting out was really hard. And I said, how did you get out of this thing when you were shot down? And he said, I didn't really have to. It was falling apart in pieces all around me. So he gets out, he waits and waits and waits to open his parachute so that he doesn't become a sitting duck. Even so, he opens his parachute, and the same guy that shot him down was aiming for him, but the flight leader shot down the guy that shot down Chuck. And that German's parachute didn't open. I'm not sure if that's true or not, because he came down right in the headquarters almost of the French underground. So I don't know what exactly happened there. In any case, Chuck, as he said, ain't a German in the world can catch a West Virginian in the woods. And he just found it, the Maquis. They said, find poor folks. They're usually not happy with the Germans. And they found him, they found each other, and they took him off to get the clothes from a woman whose husband was a POW in Germany. And then he went off to the Russian lady. She had come from Russia, and she spoke Russian, French, and English. And she was sussing out whether he was a spy or not. And so she was up on the second floor of this, she ran a spa, and she was saying, are you married? And he said, no. And she said, aha, yes, you're lying. And because he had his high school ring on his right hand, and they wear their wedding rings on the right hand in Europe. And he said, no, that's my high school ring. At that point, the Germans, we've been over there several times, and there's a tower in the south of France. I think there's only one. They had a bird's eye view of where Chuck was shot down and where he came down in the parachute. So they were on his heels, and they were downstairs at the spa while he was up in this second floor, her bedroom, and she was in bed. And so she said, get under the bed. And Chuck doesn't really trust other people, especially when his life is at stake. And there was no egress system, place to go. So he got under the bed, and the Germans came up, and she was under the covers, and she was an old lady, only 56, but at the time it seemed old, and she was coughing. I'm really sick. What are you doing disturbing an old lady? And there was no penicillin at that point. So they backed up, said, sorry, ma'am. They went back down the stairs, and that saved his life. So then they took him to the big town next door, and he hid in plain sight. He went down to a farm the next day down and stayed there for a week with a young man, Jean-Pierre. We've met Jean-Pierre. He's now 82, 83, something like that. He was about 5 years old and went fishing and played soccer with Chuck. And he said, I didn't do anything, my parents. And I said, Jean-Pierre, you kept him busy. Otherwise, he would have been out there trying to shoot a German, and kept him safe. And then he went down to Nerac and stayed with Gabriel, who was the head of the Maquis there. And Gabriel had a sort of détente with the head of the Germans there, because the Germans were a little afraid. There were a lot of woods there, and a lot of quicksand, actually. And so they didn't want to go into the woods. They'd be slaughtered. And so they had a bit of a détente. And Chuck was sitting outside watching the Germans as they went by. And Gabriel said, you do that after they went by. I called him in. He said, you do that again, and that's it for you. Well, Chuck just didn't like staying in that little barn, but he did, or little shed, but he did. And he actually fixed a motor that was there. So Gabriel was very happy. Then he was sent out with the Maquis to go on march every day. And that was great, because it kept him in shape for the next thing that happened. And they did the airdrop. What they would do is on the radio, they'd say it's raining. And then they'd know that the Halifax from England was bringing supplies. So Chuck went out with Raoul, the head of the next door neighbor Maquis group, the French underground. And they went and they amassed all the supplies, and they put them into the trucks lent by the pencil factory. And then it went to this house in the woods, which I've also seen, and they divvied up what was going on. Now, we met Raoul, and when Raoul saw Chuck Yeager 60 years later, 70 years later, he had tears in his eyes. Charlie was still alive and safe. It was very sweet. He's no longer with us either. He died in 2015 or 17, something like that. But we saw him 4 or 5 times. In any case, they didn't know how to put together the plastic explosives. But Chuck had drilled gas wells with his dad. That's what his dad did. His dad didn't own them, but he drilled them. So he knew about plastic explosives and how long a fuse and how many minutes it would take for it to blow up and all that. So he taught them about that, and he set up the bombs for them. And they wouldn't let him come out with them to blow up the bridges, because if they were caught, and also on pain of death, Raoul was told, anything happens to the airmen and you're toast. I said to Raoul, what's something that's not in his book? And Raoul said, he wasn't supposed to go out during the day. We're supposed to sleep and work at night, but he'd go off on his bicycle by himself. And I was very afraid that he wasn't coming back. And I said, well, he was trying to find his own egress systems. He didn't trust anybody. I mean, what if you were taken and you were tortured? Then you'd say where he was. So he needed to find places to hide, places to get out, so Raoul accepted that. And then what happened was the Gestapo let Gabriel know that, or the Germans let Gabriel know that the Gestapo was coming to town, because they had captured one guy and he'd given everybody up. So Gabriel let everybody know in his group and Raoul's group, go into hiding. Just go into hiding. And so, and they had to get all the airmen that were in the area and get them down to the Pyrenees early, before the snows had melted. because the Gestapo was coming to town. Now, the farmer where they staged getting all these guys into the truck, he said, oh no, they won't know about me. They won't. Well, he disappeared and they never heard from him again. But anyway, they took him in these trucks and they'd go down maybe 3 towns, and then they change trucks and they go down 3 towns and they change again. And if the chain was broken, the guy that brought him to the first group of towns didn't know where the next guy was going. And same on down the line. And they got down to the Pyrenees and they spent the night at the base. And then they were told, go ahead. And the weather again was really stinking. But so they're holding on to the guy's shoulder in front of them. There were about 9 or 10 of them to start with. And there are 3 guides. We met one of them who was really interesting. It was fun to meet him, actually. He was kind of losing his faculties a little bit. But and then they showed us they had to go around the Gestapo headquarter town, which they did. And then they kept going, and Chuck got ahead with this other guy because they were just faster, and Chuck was in better shape than any of the other guys. And it turned out the guy he was with was actually not in great shape, and they got a little bit ambushed by Germans. The guy was shot. He carried him, and they escaped, and he carried him in this 3 foot of snow, close trees. And if you tell that story in front of Chuck, he would have said, no, it wasn't that big a deal. I just slid him down in the snow. That's how humble he was. So 4 days and 4 nights carries this guy. And they actually stop at a Spanish home and where they might sell you back to the Germans. They're supposed to be neutral, but money is money. They didn't, of course, they fed them. At one point before that, they found a dead sheep and they ate some of that. And then he carried the guy down to the road, knew that the Guardia Civil, which is Spanish police, would pick him up. And he went back up in the hills and went down a little farther. Then he got down into Bassos on the Spanish side. He had dropped the guy on the Spanish side as well, but he went farther into Spain, came down into Bassos, hopped a bus, which I think is more than what you and I think of today. I think it was just a truck. You just hop on and go, and ended up in Sort, turned himself into the Spanish police, and they put him in jail. And he's like, oh, I can't do this. And so he broke out of jail, went to the hotel and slept for a day or 2. And then the consul picked him up, took him to Zaragoza, Lerida, and then to a spa. He seemed to have spent a lot of time in spas. And he kept thinking while he was in that spa for 2 or 3 weeks, and as he said, watching the girls in bikinis, what are my kids going to think how I spent the war? Eventually, they get him down from Madrid down to Gibraltar. They debrief him in Gibraltar, get him back up to England, want to send him home because if he's shot down again and tortured, he might give up where the Maquis are. So he said, no, I'm not going home. So Lieutenant Colonel, who's your boss? Goes to the Colonel, who's your boss? Goes to the General, who's your boss? Ends up in General Eisenhower's office. And and there's another guy. And General Eisenhower looks at Flight Officer Yeager and says, I've got people shooting themselves in the foot to go home. What's the matter with you? And he said, I haven't done my job. I mean, you did all this training, you spent all this money. I got to go shoot down some Germans. So General Eisenhower knew that D-Day was coming. So he said, you can go back to your squadron, don't get on combat, and I'll send word whether you can get back on or not. And that's what he did. He went back and then he was training and then D-Day happened and the Maquis rose up. So there wasn't as much secretive stuff as before. In any case, they still kept him off combat for a while. And in about July, the commanding officer calls up and says, are your guns hot? While he's training the new guys. He said, yeah. And he said, well, go provide top cover for this bomber crew that's in a dinghy. They were shot down. Okay. So they go and they provide top cover, and a Ju-88 comes out from Helgoland. So Chuck chases it back. It sees Chuck, it turns around and goes straight back, and Chuck shoots it down over the land. When they get back, he says to his commanding officer, well, I shot down a Ju-88. And his commanding officer said, Yeager, can't you do anything right? You're not supposed to be on combat. You sent me out there. So then he eventually gets back on combat in September. I think he shot down 1. And then October 12th, he shoots down 5 aircraft. So Stars and Stripes says, flyer vindicates Ike's ruling. And on that, when he shoots down the 5, what is sort of funny as he tells the story, who knows, he was a storyteller, but he said he got behind 2 airplanes and they saw that he was behind him and they crashed into each other, and he got credit for those. So he shoots down 5 on October 12th. November, he shoots down 4 in one go, and then he also shoots down a jet. Now, the jets were really fast, and so if you saw one, they could just take off and you're toast. And what was funny is he was at a seminar later in life, and this guy was saying, "Oh, I twisted and I turned and he was on my tail, then I was on his tail, and he goes on and on and on." He said, "But I eventually shot him down." So they turned to General Yeager. He said, "Well, the bigger you can make the opposition, the bigger a hero you are for hacking it," which kind of blew the wind out of the other guy's sails. But then he also said, "First time I saw a jet, I shot it down." And the story was the jet was, he was flying back after shooting, on a mission. He was coming back. He sees an ME-262 on final with its gear down and its flaps down. And so he goes and he just shoots it down. He said, unsportsmanlike, but what the hell? And then his egress was to go down the runway, is the only way to get out. And he sees them shooting at him, but they're shooting just over his canopy and hitting themselves on the other side. And he goes straight up and out. And somebody said, "Why don't you take a second pass and shoot it?" No, that's when you get shot down. And so he went back, and he had these letters between Glennis and him were just amazing. They're so sweet, but they were in two different worlds. He'd say, "I shot down 5 airplanes. I think I'm going to get a medal." And she'd say, "I had meatloaf for dinner tonight." But he was very matter of fact about what he was doing. It was so interesting. Then he came home, gathered up Glennis, went home, married her, and then was an instructor pilot in Texas for a little bit. But then the war ended, and as an evadee, he got to pick his first where he could go. And he just picked Wright-Patterson because it was closest to home. Very lucky that he did, because he became the maintenance officer there. And he flew more than anybody else because he had to check the planes, make sure they were flying okay. And as he says, there's no such thing as a natural born pilot. It takes hard work. He also says the best pilots are the most experienced. They've lived through their mistakes. So he's at Wright-Pat, and he's also doing air shows. And Colonel Al Boyd, who's head of the flight test, notices this and sends him to test pilot school. And Jack Ridley helps him get through a lot of the paperwork kind of stuff. The flying, he was fine. He could have taught people. So then when it came time, he was still the junior pilot. Colonel Boyd called him in and said, "Why do you want to fly the X-1?" Which he asked every single pilot that was there. And Chuck said, "Looks like a neat airplane to fly." He was not going for fame or fortune or anything, just duty. So everyone knows the story. He did end up on the X-1 and on the out at Edwards. And on his very first flight, he did a roll. And people say, "You did a roll with this experimental plane?" He said, "Well, that's a fighter pilot." And then he was just testing out that plane. On the 7th powered flight, as you're all pilots, you would know, he would turn the airplane, and so he'd pull more G's, get an idea of what it'd be like faster at straight and level. So he did that, and he lost control of the elevator because the shock wave was landing on the hinge of the elevator. He came down and he said, Jack Ridley, we're stuck. We can't do it. I don't know what we're going to do." And he said, and Jack thought about it, got his slide rule out, thought about it. He said, "Wait, there's a manual switch, trim switch for that horizontal stabilizer. Do you think you could use that to determine your pitch?" So he said, "Okay." So the 8th powered flight, which was a Friday, he went up and he pulled the G's, and he did. He was able to keep control. And so then he landed and he said, "Ridley, we got it made." Well, that weekend, Glennis, they were supposed to go up and visit Glennis's parents up in Grass Valley, up north of Sacramento. But Glennis wasn't feeling well. She was pregnant. And she started feeling better by Sunday night. So they went to Poncho Barnes, Happy Bottom Riding Club. They had dinner, and then they decided, let's go horseback riding. They went in the evening. So they went out horseback riding. They decided to race back to the barn. Chuck was in front, and somebody had closed the gate. I think it was Bob Hoover, because he was the next pilot to fly it if something happened to Chuck. I'm sorry, Bob, I'm kidding. Anyway, so Chuck is in front, and somebody closed the gate. So his horse, as he said, pulls 5 Gs turning, but Chuck kept going. And he broke 2 ribs and his shoulder, actually. So that night he was kind of in pain. And the next day he goes to the vet off base. He doesn't want to go to the flight dock. He'll be grounded. And he's supposed to fly Tuesday, and this is Monday. So he goes to the vet. The vet, in those days, when you have broken ribs, they taped you up. And he said, and don't do nothing strenuous, like breaking the sound barrier or something. So the next day, of course, he goes out and he always talked about Bob Cardenas was the B-29 pilot that would drop the X-1. He always would count backwards incorrectly, 10, 9, 7, 5, 4, 3, and always leave out a number and not the same number, and always drop Chuck in a stall. So he drops him and he takes off, and Chuck says, this Mach meter's all screwy. And that was their code to let the people on the radio, like Jack Ridley, know that he had broken the sound barrier, because it was really top secret. So he couldn't say, I've done it. And so they celebrated that night, and it was great. It wasn't known for, something was known, but it wasn't really known till April of 48. And so then he went, and he said that month, October, the X-1 was one of 10 test programs. And when people say, well, how did you feel? And he said, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I'd done what the old man had sent me out to do. And he also said, this one's finished. I can go on to the next. So that he stayed at Edwards till 1954. And in 1953, December 12th, I think it was, he went out. The Navy had gone out on the D558. They actually didn't reach Mach 2, but that's what they said. And Scott Crossfield didn't want to disagree with him, but later he told me that he didn't think he did, and the D558 wasn't stressed to do that. In any case, Chuck then, they had done that for the 50th anniversary of the first powered flight, but just before December 17th. But the Air Force wasn't going to be outdone, so Chuck went out and went 2.44. So he was still the fastest guy, but he learned something. Mach 2 is just a round number, but 2.44, they found out too small a tail in the X-1A. He tumbled on all 3 axes, 3 snap rolls per second for 53 seconds. He was knocked out because his head hit the canopy and put a little dent in the canopy, not his head. And he came to after 53 seconds, and he was in an inverted spin. He recognized it and put it in a regular spin, got it out of the spin, and landed the plane. Every single other pilot who had looked down their noses at him and were jealous and he'd gotten the X-1 were in great admiration that only he could have done that. And then they said, okay, the congressman went to and said, that's enough. We don't want him going. We want him to be alive. So they sent him to Germany from 54 to 58, where he was head of squadron, and they had nuke weapons aimed at Russia. And then he spent some time in France, some time in Torreon, Spain. And then he came back and he did various things with his fighter day squadron. And then he was also, went to Air Command and Staff College and Air War College, and then went to the test pilots. He went and became commandant of the test pilot school by about 62. And it was really the Aeronautical Research Pilot School, the precursor to the test pilot school. And so he taught all of the Air Force astronauts. He taught all of them, and then some that didn't make it, of course. After that, in 66, after Johnson had handed the getting into space over to NASA, which was not a good idea, we probably would have been flying in space sooner with the Air Force. But he did that to give it to his cronies in Texas. Chuck then went off to Vietnam, Clark Air Base, and he had 5 squadrons, I think, and he flew with each of them, 66 to 68. He flew with each of them. And one guy, we were at a convention, and this guy came running out and said, I want to give you a gun. And Chuck looked at the booth and he said, I can't afford your guns. They're $5,000 to $20,000. He said, no, I want to give you one. You saved our lives. So Chuck had been on a mission, and they were bombing this one hill, and Chuck had, because some guys were pinned down. So Chuck had dropped a bomb, nothing. That was very unusual for him, nothing. And a few seconds later, it was, seconds can seem like hours, kaboom, it had gone into a tunnel and blew up the center, the head of the monster, just blew it all up. And this guy, Kenny Jarrett, was one of the guys that had been pinned down, and he never forgot that. So that's just one of the many stories of Vietnam. And then in 68, he became a general. 71 to 73, he went to Pakistan for the war with India. And what was interesting about that is many years later, when I was with Chuck, we got a call from an Indian who had been an Indian fighter pilot who had been a POW. Now, we had gotten lots of crazy emails and on Twitter and on Facebook that Chuck knew the secret that the Pakistanis were hiding and harboring Indian POWs and not giving them back. And the Pakistanis would say that about the Indians. Well, Chuck did not know that. And he said, yeah, they were all handed back. So this Indian POW called and I said, yeah, why do you want to talk to General Yeager? And he said, well, the Pakistanis treated us okay. But after General Yeager interviewed us, he was doing that to find out more about the Russian aircraft. After General Yeager interviewed us, they treated us much better. So imagine your enemies thinking very highly of you and respecting you. So of course I handed the phone off and they had a nice conversation. Let's see, and then 73, he would always try to figure out what his next step is. So he went to the fellow who has made the assignments and he said, I'd like to do director of safety. And the reason he wanted to do that is he wanted to keep flying while he was in the Air Force. There's no point for him to fly a desk. So he went back to Norton, captain, or colonel, did he become a general? Anyway, Robin Olds, he was leaving that same job, but his wife was a Hollywood starlet and she wouldn't leave the house. So Glennis had to stay up back at their house in Grass Valley for a month while Chuck stayed at the BOQ until they finally got this woman out. And then they were both there at Norton. And then in 75, March the 1st, he retired, but then he became a consultant test pilot for $1 a year. And after I came along, he had never been paid. So in 2001 or two, I said to the general, you owe him $27. So I think they paid up. Anyway, I'll open up to questions if anybody has questions, or I can just keep going with more stories.
I'll just tell you, this is amazing listening to you speak, Victoria, about this stuff. It really, I mean, it's just amazing to hear you talk about him. I sort of really feel like I get to know him just a little bit through your stories. So thank you so much for sharing them with us. I'll also note, as you've been speaking, I've been thumbing through my copy of this book. I'm going to hold it close enough so you can see it. I've got a copy of the book here. It is just marvelous. And I never met Chuck, but I see these quotes that are in here. And Fan accosting General Yeager saying, "I read your book." He says, "Good, then we won't have to talk." I sort of feel like I know him a little bit from the book, but also from your stories. I'll ask, what type of flying did he like to do in later years after retirement? Did he like doing general aviation flying?
He loved general aviation flying. In fact, he flew a tail dragger like a Super Cub. He
Nice.
Really enjoyed that. And he said it was great preparation for the P-51 because it was a much lighter aircraft, so it could be picked up and tossed around. Mm-hmm. And so he said, yeah, no, it's great. Tail drag. When we were flying, I'll just tell you this story. I was learning to fly. And so we're coming in and the wind picks us up and heads us towards the trees. Now, I don't know much. All of you probably would know this, but I didn't know this. And so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to hurt? And then he cobs it. We're going faster towards the trees. Okay, that's going to hurt a little bit more than I. And of course, you all know he was getting more air over the wings and getting control of the aircraft and brought it back and landed. And then 45 minutes later, after we put the plane to bed and we're driving home, he said, I ran out of air room. Just like, like nothing. It was pretty funny. I learned a lot just by flying with him. We had various things happen. For instance, I was just talking to some kids that are learning to fly. When I was getting my license, 2008, there were fires in California. So the visibility was terrible. So I had to sort of suspend a little bit, but we went flying. There was 4 miles visibility. As you all know, that's VFR rules. That would be fine. Mm-hmm. We took off. We couldn't see anything. Couldn't see the airport. So we went back and Chuck said, we'll just do some slow flight and some pattern work and call it a day. That's what we did. 2 days later, and I was thinking to myself, there's no way I'd fly in this, even though it's legal. 2 days later, it's 7 miles visibility. And we're flying over the ridge or the foothills, and we're going over to Nancy's and Willows, and we're going to have lunch. And I'm thinking to myself, I think I'm comfortable. I think I'd be comfortable flying in this, but am I comfortable because Chuck Yeager's at the stick, or am I comfortable because I'd be on my own? And as I'm thinking this, he was uncanny in how he could read my mind. He said, as soon as we can't see the ground, we're turning back, which meant he knew exactly where he was going to land at any given second if there was a problem.
Yeah. That's so interesting to hear you talk about him as an instructor, as a teacher, because a lot of people who are terrific pilots are not necessarily great teachers. So he assumed a lot of roles, had success in many of them, but it sounds like he was a fantastic instructor as well.
He was very much an encourager and very much never panicked, never. He didn't want me to learn how to fly because, as you know, it's the most dangerous time at flying is learning how, because does the instructor pilot take over, or do they let you make a mistake, or what? Sure. And so, but I went to him and I said in 2007, beginning of 2008, and I said, I want to learn to fly. I want you to support me in this. He came out to every single lesson. Yeah. Every single one. I don't think I would have made it without him. Yeah. Because he corrected a few things.
Sure. No pressure. That's just Chuck Yeager over right. by the Quonset hut coaching right. And landing, right?
Right. Well, I was my first landing with the instructor was actually one of my best landings ever, and because I'd been flying with Chuck and a lot of different CFIs, all his friends had CFIs and all that, and so he sped me up. So right before my check ride, I was coming in too fast to do a short field landing. Yeah. And it was so frustrating. And so Chuck was watching from outside, right? And he said to the guy, "You have her coming in at 3 or 4 knots too fast." And he said, "That's exactly right." How did he know that? I said, "Let me introduce you. This is Chuck Yeager." Yeah. And I'll tell you, when I first started, the first time I flew with him, so he's checking the plane, right? And I'm at one end of the plane and he's at the other. And so he shakes the wing a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking he's flirting. No, he was checking to see if the wing was going to fall off.
Right. I loved your little Bob Hoover remark in passing. That was pretty funny. Barry noted, "I understand there was a healthy rivalry between Chuck and Scott Crossfield."
That was made up. That was there. I'll tell you what Frank Borman answered when they were at the test pilot school, and it was Frank Borman and Chuck Yeager on the stage. Frank Borman said there was no competition. Scott Crossfield did not light a candle to Chuck Yeager. Somebody made that up just to get press or media. Sure. That's what that was about. Okay. And even Scott Crossfield himself, just one-on-one with me, said there's no competition at all.
Just talk.
Yeah. But it might make you go farther, faster, and might make you go out to 2.44 and discover inertial coupling. But here's the thing about that: too small a tail. Now, do you remember Spaceship One? So there was that contest with Spaceship One, and the first flight up was so squirrely that pilot would not fly it again. And I didn't think it counted because there was a sack of potatoes in the back, not somebody in the back screaming, "We're going to die." So it's a little bit different when you had to have a passenger. So they had to get another pilot. And what they didn't learn from 1953 discoveries. They had too small a tail on that Spaceship One. That was the problem. Mm-hmm. So they didn't advance aviation at all, which is crazy to get an award for not advancing aviation. Mm-hmm.
I was, and I think people of a certain age got to be aware of Chuck during the movie The Right Stuff and the book The Right Stuff. Did he like the movie? Did he enjoy that?
Sure. I mean, it was fun to watch him because they had the 20th anniversary re-release kind of thing, and so I watched it with him, and there are a couple of times he'd say, "Oh, BS," and all that. Yeah. But and it makes him look like he just rode up on a horse, got in the airplane, and broke the sound barrier, which is not what happened. But he liked it. I mean, Sam Shepard did a pretty good job, and he said, "I'm a little jealous of Sam Shepard. He's got Jessica Lange driving a pickup truck." What's wrong? He's a great guy. Yeah. And Sam didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it at all. And he didn't like flying. He wasn't going to fly, nothing, not going to happen. But the director, Phil Kaufman, was smart enough to put them together, and they circled a little bit, and then they got together. And then Sam actually went flying with Chuck. And as Barbara Hershey
Yep.
And she went flying with him. And as they said to each other, they said, well, if we auger in, at least we augured in with Chuck Yeager.
Boy,
So he enjoyed it. He did a lot of the flying there, flew probably every single one of the stars in there. They
yeah.
had a good time.
I can't get over the humility. I mean, that's sort of the, as I said, I never met Chuck Yeager, but the man I know him to be from seeing him on talk shows and interviews and reading about him as extremely humble, aw shucks kind of guy. And everything you have said tonight sort of affirms that perception of him. He really was just a guy who loved to fly and deferred credit when he could.
Well, he would have gotten a second star. They wanted him to go into the Pentagon. He said, oh, BS, I'm not going in the Pentagon. In fact, in 2003, so what is that, 28 years after he retired, there was a guy yelling at me. I'm the newcomer. I'd only met him in 2000. He's yelling at me, and he never had to go into the Pentagon. That's not fair. That's funny.
I enjoyed in the book, there was he was sort of a safety investigator, and President Reagan appointed him to the committee that was investigating the Challenger disaster, but it didn't, I don't know if it wasn't a good fit, or Chuck wasn't going in for the politics and the showmanship of it. That was my reading of it, but you can keep me honest on that.
Right. Well, let me start from the director of safety. So when he came in as director of safety, they had primary cause and secondary causes. And they'd fix the primary cause, but they wouldn't fix the secondary cause until one of them became a primary cause. Just really dumb. So he changed the protocol, made it an all-cause accident. So they'd fix everything. And it spilled out to the civilian world. He probably saved tens of millions of lives doing that.
Yep.
But NASA, being the arrogant NASA that they were at the time, they didn't do that. And so when he saw the Challenger incident or accident, he was disgusted. But as he said, everybody, when he even getting on the plane to go back to the meeting, he already knew. Everybody knew. We knew that it was the O-rings. It was too cold.
Right.
And he said that they were going day after day, and they were afraid that the media was leaving and everybody's leaving, and they wanted publicity. And he said they got their publicity. So he went back, and they already decided in the first meeting. So he was done. He left. He wasn't going to live off of the 5-star hotel and champagne and caviar. He had things to do. Yeah. Well, the rest of the committee wanted to live off our taxpayer dollars. Thank you very much. And so they had to justify themselves and badmouth him. But the truth was they knew. And then there was an arrogant guy that didn't know what he was doing, but he's a scientist. And so 6 or 7 months later, he went on TV to show everybody because he had discovered what had happened. Well, no, they knew way before. It's this arrogance. Yeah. So
interesting. Michael has a question and says, "Isn't it true that Chuck was actually in the movie playing a waiter in the diner in the movie?" I think he did have a cameo.
Yeah, Fred. He played the bartender.
Yeah.
You want a whiskey? Coke. Coke? You want a Coke in a clean glass? Coke. He had fun.
I imagine it must be pretty nice. It must have been pretty nice to be Chuck Yeager. I mean, you just got all of this tremendous goodwill directed toward you for your contributions to aviation and to our country. He seems to really have enjoyed being Chuck Yeager. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Well, I'll tell you, that's funny you say that, but there was a lot of trouble because there's a lot of jealousy. And when he was finishing his tour in Vietnam, he was supposed to do another tour, but the guy that came in that was in charge of all it, Momeyer, didn't want him at all. Yeah. But nobody liked Momeyer. So he went to General Ben Davis Jr., the first Black general in the Air Force. And he said, "I'm getting out of the Air Force. This is absurd. These generals are fighting over whether I stay or not. I'm obviously I should stay. I'm experienced." Yep. And Ben Davis said to him, "I've had prejudice too. I mean, Black guy, right?" And Chuck's
about that, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, a hillbilly. That's what I was trying to come up with. So they sort of bonded, and he said, "We'll find a good place for you. Don't worry." So that was really good. And actually, that was when the Pueblo flap. I think that's when that happened. And he was he went over and watched over that. So he did do some good things. He always did some good things, but he always looked at life. You got to have fun. Yeah. And his best friend was shot down in World War II in the first few months. And so you lost a lot of your buddies, and you learned not to get too close to anybody. But I'll tell you the one story. So Beale Air Force Base had a 8-mile road that they hadn't fixed since 1945. And every politician in the area wanted their picture with Chuck. He said, get away from me till you fix that road.
Road,
You
right.
need safety for your airmen. And
Uh-huh.
so finally, this one councilman or committee, whatever, he called us and we got it done.
Yeah.
And the guy came back and said, we'd like to name it after General Yeager. Would that be okay with him? So I asked him, I said, they want to name the road after you. He said, why? Why do you want to name the road? And I had to explain to him, because you're a hero and you're this. Now, the other part about all that you say, enjoying being Chuck Yeager, we would get so much mail before email, so much mail. It was ridiculous. And I ended up taking over a few different jobs. And so one day I had a meltdown and I said, I am so tired of this Chuck Yeager stuff. He said, I'm always Chuck Yeager. Yeah, you got a point there, bud.
Yeah. I'll watch for questions in the chat if you have any before we let you go. I will also note that Chuck Yeager was the 1984 recipient of the Aero Club of New England's Godfrey L. Cabot Award. So our organization has long known, appreciated, and respected all that he has brought to aviation.
Well, let me tell you about the NF-104. I kind of skipped that when I was going through his history. Okay. In 1963, again, they were doing some records before the 60th anniversary. Was it? Yeah, 60th anniversary of the first powered flight. In any case, they were trying to do an altitude record. And in the morning, he had gone up to 118,000 feet. And then in the afternoon, he'd gone up to 104,000 feet. But the problem was the engine that would turn, there's no altitude, there's no enough lift up there. So he had to use the jack screw to turn the plane down so it would come down first, nose first.
Okay.
And so it broke and it didn't work. So he came in tail first and he ended up in a flat spin.
Right. And lost.
And so he kept trying to get it out of that flat spin. And every time he would get the nose down, it would come back up and the parachute came out and he just couldn't get it. And so he did about 90,000 feet in a flat spin. And the guy flying chase it was telling him to punch out, punch out, punch out. But if you punch out below 6,000 feet, it's far safer than above it. So Chuck was just riding it out, trying to fix it till below 6,000 feet. And so he punched out, but the problem was the plane was going down at 100 miles an hour. He punched out at 100 miles an hour, so he was suspended. And the rocket seat got caught in the shroud lines. And then it came down and hit his face mask, set it on fire. And he knew that he had to put the face mask up to stop the oxygen flow. He's gulping in air. And he's, trying to get the fire out, and he gulping in air. He burns the tips of his two little, the ring finger, little finger, his left hand, and he burned the left side of his face. And he came down and he got his helmet off. Usually you need 3 people to do that. And this guy was driving by and he came out and he looked at me, he was like horrified. And they got to him pretty quickly. And then he went in and they ended up what happened was, they were scraping his eye and they were trying to, because there was blood over it, caked over it. And they thought he had lost his eyesight.
Oh my God.
And he could see anything, see nothing, see anything, nothing, see anything, nothing. And they finally got through and he could see. And it was, and that fire seared the blood over his eye and saved his eye.
Oh my God.
And so then every 3 days they'd scrape his face so he wouldn't have those horrible burn marks that you can get. And it was very, very painful. And they did that for a month. And then after a month was up, being in the hospital, he debriefed on that flight and he remembered every single detail. Wow. It was amazing. He had incredible recall, very present when things were happening.
Yeah. I think when David Letterman on the David Letterman show, the talk show, when David Letterman asked him about that particular flight, the quote in the book, I want to make sure I get it right, was something like, yeah, it can kind of ruin your day.
Yeah, it can ruin your whole day.
It can ruin your whole day. Very aw shucks about the whole business. Wow.
I encourage everybody listening, go Google that David Letterman interview. It's hilarious, isn't it? It's funny.
Did you enjoy talking about I can't get enough of that stuff. I know many people can as well, but did he enjoy talking about his accomplishments, some of his flights?
He liked recounting his life, but as somebody said to me, he could say it without arrogance or without bravado. It was more like, I brushed my teeth today. I broke the sound barrier and this is what happened. And it's really,
Like they say, it's not bragging if you did it, if you can
right,
do it, and he did it.
right. That's one of my favorite ones too. Rules are made for those who are unwilling to make up their own, but
Yeah.
people forget the rest of it. You better be right. So when he was in Vietnam, and there was the guy that was his commanding officer was upset because there was a schedule. It would go into a certain plane would go into maintenance, and that would come out in 2 days, and that was it. You had to do that. And Chuck would say, but that was shot down 2 days ago. I don't care. That one has to come out. And he'd sit on the end of the where the hangar was, and he'd watch. So what they decided to do is they just changed the numbers, and he got out of there with the skin on his teeth, and he thought, boy, that paperwork, they must have had a mess to clean up after.
Yeah. Barry asked, did he actually take the plane out of the hangar as depicted in the movie?
Take the X-1 out of the plane?
Yeah, I guess
out of the hangar?
I don't know. Yeah.
No, what they would do is there's a place at Edwards that says sorry, let me start again. There's a place at Edwards where there's the Yeager pit, and they would put the X-1 down in that pit, and they'd roll the B-29 over it, and then they'd strap it on into the bomb bay of the B-29. So no, he wasn't there when they were doing that. But you know, the other thing about that is he did all the maintenance on the X-1. It was his derriere on the line. He wasn't going to let anybody else touch that airplane.
Yeah. And
he was made sure that when they filled it up, they then topped it off before they took off, because it was nitrogen and liquid oxygen, so it was evaporating quickly.
Evaporating was, yeah, sure. Gee, this is a great question from Jason. Once Chuck was done with military and consulting, what became his priorities? Did he get involved with encouraging young people to get into aviation, et cetera? I'm in the Civil Air Patrol, and we have a Yeager Award for aerospace education. So Chuck is still inspiring us. Nice.
That's great. I appreciate that. Well, you know, he became chairman of the Young Eagles.
Yeah.
So Cliff Robertson was the first one for about a year, and they weren't getting that many. They wanted to get 1 million by December 17, 2003, the 100th anniversary of the first powered flight. Yeah. So Chuck took over, and they got 1.3 million.
Mission accomplished.
And we were in Kitty Hawk for that, but it was the weather was stinking, so we didn't fly the sort of 1 millionth kid. It wasn't really, but we decided that was the 1 millionth kid. Yeah. So he came out to Grass Valley, and we flew him much later. But at Kitty Hawk, they had the 100 top aviators, and Baby Bush, President Bush at the time, came, and he mentioned only Chuck of all of them. And it was pretty fun. And John Travolta was there. And John Travolta wanted to meet Chuck, just desperately wanted to meet Chuck. So he'd been following where he was. And so the first thing he says to Chuck when we're on stage with him, he said, you know, Qantas has the best safety record of any airline. Really? That's the first, you do a commercial for Chuck? The first thing you said, he was so nervous. And the same thing with Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford had been following him around, and people had been saying, oh yeah, Chuck will be here. And so Harrison would go to the event, and we weren't there. And so finally he sees him. The first thing he says, you want a whiskey? We got to get a whiskey. We got to. It's like, oh my God.
That is hilarious. Harrison Ford was also a Cabot Award recipient from a couple of years ago. But the idea, I mean, I guess we'd all be nervous meeting General Chuck Yeager, I suppose. You could forgive him for being a little bit nervous. What I want to just do a quick screen share to show the cover of your book, which there it is. I hope you can see that. There we go. What is something that we might be surprised to hear about Chuck that many people don't know that you might be willing to share with us?
Well, so we got married in 2003, and I can tell you our whole married life, the longest argument we had was 5 minutes, and then he'd have me rolling on the floor laughing. I mean,
funny guy.
Yeah, well, and it's all small stuff. When you fought combat, you've been shot at. It's all small stuff, right? And there was nothing that we, vastly disagreed on, but it was great. And he was always intellectually curious, which keeps you young, always. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I think he was 75, and he was waiting for his elk to be butchered. And so the guy, a friend, had a sewer truck, and so he went with him and collecting sewage.
How's that work? I'd like to know more about that.
Well, no, but he got underneath it to see how it was working. I mean,
Yeah.
he's just, you know, at 75, he just kept going and was very keen on learning.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about how you met and when you met and what that was like? Did you know
So,
it was Chuck Yeager?
so I had a deal at CBS, a TV movie, and they were messing it up, and they also were cheating me. We hadn't even started. So I went out to hike. It's a beautiful day, and just clear my head and see what I was going to do about it. And as I'm going up the hill, coming down the hill is this really handsome guy. The sun's behind his head. It's like this halo. And I said, "Hey, great day." And he said, "I just got back from Australia." And I said, "Well, I just got back from Africa." I said, "What were you doing in Australia?" And he said, "I was teaching software." I said, "Oh, I was volunteering. I need to refill the coffers. I can teach software. Can you get me a job?" And he said, "No, I'm not a software guy. I'm a fighter pilot. I'm Chuck Yeager." I was thinking, wait, military, Chuck Yeager. Is he the Chuck Yeager? Are there a lot of Chuck Yeagers? And I'm thinking all this. And I said, "Okay, will you give me a ride in a military jet?" He said, no, that costs tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars. And I said, "I pay taxes." He's, "I gotta go." So he starts walking down the hill, and I said, "Okay, you won't get me a job. You won't take me in a fighter jet. You want to go hiking tomorrow?" And he turns around, and he looks at his watch, and he says, "It's 3 o'clock. That's my truck down there. It's got an X1 on it. Do you know what that is?" I said, "No, I used to be so good at school. I mean, I just gotten back with tribes in Africa." So, and he said, broke the sound barrier. I said, "Oh, that's right. That's you. I saw the movie." And he said, "What movie?" And I said, "The Right Stuff." "All righty then." He walks a few more steps, and he turns around and goes, wait a minute. You can't go too fast. I'm older than you." And I said, "You think I stopped to talk to you 50 feet from the start of the trail? I'm tired." So we met the next day, and the first thing he said to me is, "I'm never getting married." And I'm not getting married again. And I said, "I'm never getting married, so it's okay." Yeah. And then, 3 years later.
That's been said before. Yeah, we know how it worked out. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting when we got married. So he said, "Find out how you get married in Reno." I said, "Reno? I don't want to get married in Reno. You have to get married when you get married in Reno." And so a friend of ours came out. We call him our Jewish diamond dealer friend. And so Chuck took him flying. And for some reason that day I called to find out how you get married. And they said, "Well, we have a satellite office in Incline Village. So I can get married at Tahoe. That's okay." So as we're driving this guy back to the airport, Chuck looks in his rear mirror and he says, "Did you find out?" I said, "How did he know that?"
Yeah.
And so I said, "Yes, we have to get there before 12, or because they're closed between 12 and 1. And our diamond dealer friend would say, wait, you can't do anything. I have to send you the rings." I said, "Why don't you stay and be a witness?" No. So we go the next day. We get there at 20 to 12. As Chuck tells the story, we paid $50 for the license. And we said, are we married? Is that it? Yeah. And he said, no, you have to. The judge can marry you up on the 3rd floor. So we go up there and they say, "Well, that'll be $55. Do you have rings? No. Do you have witnesses? No. Do you have a special ceremony? No. We just want to be married." So we go in and the judge says, "Do you take that?" And he said, "I have a poem I read for people like you so I can earn my money." And then we were married. And then Chuck, we don't know what to do with ourselves. So Chuck invites him to lunch. And he can't go because he's got a prior engagement. He's apoplectic to go to lunch with Chuck Yeager on his wedding day. So we leave. And as Chuck said, 20 minutes later and $105 poorer, we were married. And then we were getting divorced for the next 24 hours because we were so freaked out. But then we calmed down and we were fine. So that's sort of our story together. But, I can tell you, if people want to hear some more stories, I can look at the book and tell some more if they're interested.
Let me show the book one more time. It is a marvelous book. It really, really is. And it's so wonderful to have you be able to sort of, I don't know, just share these stories about this amazing man, kind of keep his legacy, alive, really alive and living through your stories. It really is great. You can find this anywhere, but if you go, what's the best way to get the book? Is it chuckyeager.com?
The Right Stuff store.
Yeah.
Or you can email me at editor@chuckyeager.com, and you can do Venmo or Zelle or PayPal.
It is a wonderful and charming book about a real American hero. I can't thank you enough for taking time to be with us, and God, you're such a marvelous storyteller. You have some great material to work with, of course, but
right. Thank you.
You do such a great job. Feels like we're right there with you and with Chuck. So
what the Military Writers Society of America, they said with this book, as you already know, you really do get to know him a lot better, the man.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, thank
So
you
yeah,
so very much for sharing the stories and sharing a little bit of Chuck. I just sort of feel like I'm a little closer and know him a little bit better for hearing you speak about him so much. So thank you for sharing with us tonight. Really, really appreciate it.
thank you very much for having me. I love talking about him. Great
Yeah.
man.
One more time, the book is called 101 Chuck Yeager-isms, Wit and Wisdom from America's Hero. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you.
And so we will, I guess, wrap up in a minute, but not before I remind you that our next event is going to be with Richard McSpadden from the Air Safety Institute, our big crash course event. This will be happening next month, again, March 15th at the Burlington Marriott. Stephen K. Brown from the FAST team, FAA Administrator Colleen DeSandro, and Richard McSpadden himself, who's got some terrific stories as a former Air Force pilot and #1 pilot for the Thunderbirds, and now, of course, with the AOPA's Air Safety Institute. He does a fantastic job. It's going to be a great program. And again, it's going to be on Wednesday, March 15th at the Burlington Marriott. You can find out more at ACONE.org. That's an incredibly well received event and a very, very worthwhile event. I hope you make plans to attend. So again, Victoria, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us for this Icebreaker event. Thank you so much. Safe flying. Be well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.